Is it time for a name shift? If you don't know what that means, then join me, your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast. Formerly known as the Mind Shift podcast, it's time for a change. And if you're someone who's looking to rebuild their life after dismantling whatever doctrine may have controlled you, then this show is for you. I'm happy today to be speaking with author Ryan George. I think someone reached out to me, your press agent, I think, about your new book. So welcome, Ryan, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad we were able to connect. I'm looking at your press bio, and I was immediately struck by the fact that you and I, we do have a lot in common. You've got a book that's out called Hurt and Healed by the Church, Redemption and Reconstruction After Spiritual Abuse. So is that available? Is it on Amazon and all the rest of it? All the normal places you get your books?
Yeah, all the normal places, audio, electronic book, and print.
So this is really interesting because, as we said before we hit record, I think you and I are going to have a lot in common, at least as far as our backgrounds. Now, you grew up, according to your bio, you were part of the Independent Fundamental Baptist, the IFB Church, including one where your dad was the pastor. Mm-hmm. Let's get into your backstory. So you grew up basically as a fundamentalist.
Yeah, from about 1982. So I was 4 years old. I got dunked after vacation Bible school with my friends. You know, we all raised our hands and got dunked into it until I walked away. I was about 24 years old, 2002. My comfortable proponing for it waned over time, right? By the time I left it, my heart was well on the way out. But when I was in the thick of it, you know, the early 90s, I was flag carrying, proud to be called. You know, in college, I had a writing internship and I took over my dad's column in the newspaper, and I was just like a flamethrower, just throwing every horrible. I hope nobody read that column in the paper. I hope nobody has a copy of it.
It's out there somewhere.
It's out there somewhere.
What were you taking such a stand against? I mean, obviously, I've talked to, in fact, a good friend of mine, Bruce Geringster. He was a pastor out of Ohio of IFB churches for decades, and he's since become an atheist, but we've had fantastic conversations. But yeah, so he grew up in all that, and he talks about just that, you know, the rage, the militancy of the fundamentalists. Was that what you were into?
That's a good word for it. Yeah, everything was a battle to be won. And every other person wasn't a soul to be winsomely convinced into what you believe. They were somebody to be conquered. You know, here's all the things that you have to believe to be right with God. You have to read only this version of the Bible. You have to wear only these clothes. You have to attend services only on these days. There was just all this extra biblical, extraneous, artificial stuff that was added on top to give you a sense that you had exclusivity. You had this special relationship to the divine. But now I just think it's preposterous, especially in light of human history and especially in light of global everything, right? Like, it's so myopic, this belief system, but who knows what I was writing about at the time. I mean, everything torqued you off. Like that was the whole point, is that you lived in a constant state of outrage.
Yeah. Were you into the political sector as well? You know, that was another part of it. Obviously, there's the dominion theology piece, you know, guys trying to take dominion politically in that sense as Christians.
Yeah, I wasn't as militant about that part. I was very fascinated by it. I was Rush Limbaugh 3 hours a day. In high school, I was paying to be part of his fan club, and, you know.
Oh, you were a ditto head?
Yeah, I was a ditto head. I got his music and I played it in my truck. You know, he used to do all those jingles and stuff. But back then, it wasn't about the dominionism like how we've learned to frame it now. It was just a fascination with the machinations of it all. Like, how does it work? How do I get in on it? You know, I was a lobbyist for 2 weekends in the early 90s or in the early 2000s for the industry in which I work. We went to Capitol Hill to lobby. I was like, oh no, I don't want any part of this.
Right.
After talking to congressmen and senators, helpers, and they're like, hey, you know, you're up against banks on this one, right? I was like, yeah, but this is a consumer protection issue. They're like, you realize you're up against banks, right? And I was like, oh, I got you. Okay. Yeah, I'm not a player here. I'm out.
Yeah. Deep pockets, man. You're never going to have a chance. Yeah, it's fascinating. Were you a King James only guy as well? You were saying a certain type of the Bible had to have been a King James only, surely.
So I wasn't as big on that personally, But the college that I went to, when they started their seminary, I think it was like 1998, 99, whatever they started their seminary. As you know, like seminaries like to have one big thing that they're known for, right? And they founded that seminary on the KJV only issue. And they tried to sell it to us, and it just didn't go over. Obviously, you're going to get uptick from somebody on campus, but our last senior class, like we were all going to get together and sign yearbooks and say goodbye, whatever. They put up videos, going off on Bob Jones because they weren't KJV only anymore. I was like, really, this is our retrospective. Like, we're not going to look at pictures of the last 4 years of awesome life on campus.
Nope. Bob Jones one's gone liberal.
Now, my parents are that way. A lot of the people that I associated with during that time are that way. I have siblings that are still KJV only, or at least in their daily practice, that's the only one that they read. But no, I'm an ambivert. We have a Bible study group that I am a part of. It's an outdoor Bible study. And we sit around the fire, and it's a requirement that we read it out of at least 2 different translations and paraphrases before we even start to dig in. And usually we try to do 3 or 4, and we'll pull from all different streams to get that. I'm just not that way anymore.
You're not that diehard about it?
No, there were things I was diehard about, but that one wasn't one of them.
Yeah, and you've already alluded to the fact that you've been able to somehow reclaim your Christian faith, which, as we said before we hit record, that's a big difference between you and me. We both grew up in the church and all the rest of it, but I'm sure we can get into that maybe later. But what is it about fundamentalism? You were mentioning, adding all these things, but yet it strikes me that they were trying to be purists. Why are they adding all this stuff? Is it more about control? Because if you go back, the fundamentalists versus the liberals, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they're reacting against the liberalism creeping into the theology of the Christian church and all the rest of it. So they become very militant. Is that the offshoot that you were part of, that sort of diehard militant fundamentalist?
Yeah, and I think the Baptist version of that response started closer to World War I. Like, fundamentalism in general started, in the late 1800s, but the Baptist version that I was in, and it was really built around an authoritarian regime where that's the I in the IFB, is the independent. It's like these men don't have elders. They don't have any denominational structure vertically to where they would be responsible to somebody else or somebody would be responsible to them. And it creates these little kingpins, it's almost like an imam in the Muslim faith where they get to determine not just your theology, but your practice. So back when I used to live in Indiana, the different Amish sects, right? Some of the elders would say, well, you can have ball bearings, or no, you can only have, wood axles with grease, or you can have a covered wagon and you can't, or you can have electric lights or just reflect, like stuff that, why is the church determining that level stuff? And it was the same in my faith, right? Like there were pastors I've read about, not in our church, but at adjacent churches, who were like, your girls can't have open-toed sandals. They can only have closed-toed sandals, or like men and women can't swim together except for siblings. And then some people were like, not even siblings, right? Like there's all these things. And that's the irony, right? Because a fundamentalist, you would think, would be a minimalist. Like they would have fewer fundamentals. Like it would be
there's only a
smaller footprint.
Yes.
Yeah, and they have so many more.
Yeah, they've got hundreds now.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I mean, the blue book at our college was ridiculous. Like I was telling another podcaster this week, someone came around as adults. We were adults. We were voting. We could fight. We could lose our life in war as adults. And they would come around and shut our lights off like we were 7-year-olds at night. And they would check. They would go back around like 45 minutes later, and they would open the door to make sure your lights were off, you weren't studying after hours. And I was talking to my roommate on the top bunk one night, and he couldn't make out what I was saying. So I stood next to my bed in the dark so that he could hear me better. They opened the door and they're like, name and ID. And I was like, Ryan George, 77480. 25 years later, I still know that number.
It sounds like some bad military experience. I mean, that's
what it was.
They didn't even treat us that bad in the military.
Right. It's funny you say that. So all of my sisters and I went to that same college, and my brother was like, screw this, I'm going to the Air Force. And he actually had an easier go.
Yeah. I don't need this authority. Yeah, it might be easier in the military. It's such a fascinating thing, isn't it? Because I remember reading through Bob Jones University's student handbook a few years ago, and it was just the same kind of thing that you're describing. Just rule upon rule upon rule upon rule. And I'm like, come on. I mean,
and we spun off of them to go more conservative. Like
they were too liberal.
Jerry Falwell was considered practically secular.
Wow.
Like that's how far right, I'm not talking politically, but right theologically, that they were just like, and there were some further right than us. I mean, there was one, who was it? One of my friends was going to, and like all the girls on campus had to have their hair cut at the same length so that nobody's hair could be more of a stumbling block to the men on campus than anybody else. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Where do you draw the line? Now
that's the thing, is everybody gets to draw their own.
Exactly. You can just, as long, and it's always men who are in charge of this whole thing, because obviously you're describing, it must be a deeply patriarchal system. It's a male dominated thing, both in the home and in the church. Men are in charge, men are pastors, men are the final say in the home as well.
It's so counterintuitive to me because they treat not just their kids, but even their spouse as chattel.
Yeah.
Right. Like the way that they talk about their daughters, if you've seen the Shiny Happy People documentary or any of those similar works, it's like horse trading. It's like 1,000 years ago somewhere, I'll give you 4 sheep for her or whatever. Like my dad, I'm so thankful it didn't work for me. Like I was already on my way out. But he's like, this is the one I've chosen for you. And I was like, screw that. Like I don't, she's nice. I don't think she's ugly or a horrible person, but I have a girlfriend like this. I picked one for myself, and he resented that. I mean, when I got married, he told my wife, he's like, you're not a legitimate part of this family.
Good God.
I picked her.
Yeah, because you went against his authority. Now, in your bio, you say you grew up in a cult, and that's the big difference, isn't it? Because I've discovered that over the years, as I've researched cult psychology, cult tactics, and all those kind of things, that were the practices that were used on me growing up, because obviously you were part of the Bill Gothard thing. You talk about shiny, happy people. Why do you say that it was a cult specifically?
So I think that's where high control religion becomes a cult, is when it starts creating its own definition for what true religion is and who can get in and who can get out. All religion does that to some extent, right? But there's this place where it starts to become super arbitrary and super weird. I give 3 definitions of a cult in the book that aren't, Webster's dictionary, but one of them is like, you get fascinated on a tertiary thing to just a weird level. You worship in a very unorthodox way. Like if you all have to wear the same sneakers or whatever it is, I can't remember what the third one is now, but everything we did was to differentiate ourselves from mainstream religion. Right. Like I'll give you an example. So my grandmother was a devout religious person. She was Lutheran, faithful to her church. And we weren't even allowed to visit a church with my grandma. Like we couldn't, like if we're visiting my grandma, we couldn't even go to, because some weird, and I remember I was probably 35 years old the first time I went to church with my grandma. And I remember walking in going, this is so weird. Like, why is this the first time I'm going? But we were told your grandma's going to hell. That's an evil place to go. Satan's in that, and so you go, my goodness, you are so far away from orthodoxy that I think you're still a religion, but I think you're more a cult than you are a church.
Well, and there's certainly the religious trauma syndrome aspect of it as well. I mean, I think you and I probably both had similar experiences growing up where we were, rapture anxiety and fear of going to hell, losing our salvation and all those kind of things. I mean, that leads to religious trauma syndrome. Did you kind of suffer from some of those things when you were a kid growing up in this IFB church?
Oh yeah. Like how many hundreds of times have you said, hey, dear God, if we're not good, we're good now. Right. Like,
yeah. Pray that sinner's prayer.
Yeah. Yeah. And
one more time.
Oh crap. Whatever it was, I saw a pretty girl or I heard a song that had a bad word in it or whatever. And you're like, hey God, like, I'm really sorry about that. But like, if we're good now, right? Like, the way I described it to a lot of people in my life is it was superstitious. It was this, if I do a certain amount of things, then I'll be on God's good side, which makes sense because that's how it works with my dad, right? I got love as long as I did all these crazy things that he wanted me to do, And so I think there was a lot of overlap for me that it was a 1-for-1. I was scared of a God who said he loved me but wanted to knock me down because I had a physical dad, a biological dad who said he loved me and wanted to knock me down. And so I may have got a little bit more dose of that than other people in the IFB movement. I got more of that than my sisters did. My dad was not physically abusive with them or my brother. And so like they have different things to work through, I'm sure. But for me, it was like, man, and I can't quote which psychologist it is, but there's a study going right now. They're trying to develop, I think, for a book idea that you can tell what kind of religious trauma somebody has by whether they pray to the Holy Spirit, to Jesus, or God the Father. And it blew me away because I always prayed to Jesus. And that makes total sense. If I'm scared of my physical dad and he is a representation of God the Father, it makes sense that I don't ask favors of him or I don't come to worship him. I talk to his son, So yeah, they're still developing that. And I was really intrigued by that concept, but it's definitely true for me.
That is a fascinating thing. I've never thought about that. But I certainly agree with that. I mean, I've heard this how many times growing up in church, that our view of God is fashioned or conditioned by our own fathers or lack of a dad, because my dad, he wasn't abusive in that way. He was a sexual abuser of some of my sisters, but I didn't know about that until much later, a couple of years before he died. But that was all a big secret that was all covered up. But he was very emotionally distant. And that was the way I always viewed God. When I was a Christian, I thought, I can't connect with God. I can't relate to this God. He can't relate to me. So you could see that, like in your case, your dad's abusive. You're afraid of this God.
Yeah. And the theology that I was being taught in sermons, not just by him, but at, summer camps and at quote unquote Christian college and whatever else, only reinforced that, right? It's like, here's all the hoops you have to jump through. And if you were to die tonight, are you sure? There's a phrase I quote in the book all the time. I don't know why it is. I don't know if this was true in the churches you grew up in, but they'd always say, you can be hit by a Mack truck tomorrow. And I was like, why is it always a Mack truck that's going to be my demise? Like,
can't it be a Kenworth or
a bus or
a car? No, it has to be a Mack truck.
It has to be a Mack truck. But there was a fear mongering, right? Because in fundamentalism, and it's probably bigger than just fundamentalism, but definitely the flavor that I had, there was no attempt to make our Christianity a winsome appeal and attraction, right? And you can see the megachurch non-denominational movement that started in the late 90s and blew up in the early 2000s was a response to that, right? They were like, no. And a lot of times they'll actually refer to it as an attractional model. My church has actually gone away from that now because you can fall in the ditch on either side of that, right? But the church I grew up with, they're like, we don't care. This is it. You're going to hell. Come in and get some fire insurance. And so everything was militant. Everything was, hey, we're not trying to make this sweet and beautiful and attractive. We're trying to say, come in now or die, which is so extreme.
It is extreme. Yeah. What kind of a person gets attracted to that sort of a model? Because I was a pastor. I was an elder in Portland, Oregon for about 12 years. And our big thing, when I first started, we were part of the Willow Creek Association.
Yeah.
So what you were just saying, the seeker-sensitive service. We actually had, when I first started at that church, we had 2 complete services. We had our seeker service, and then we turned around and did a believer service afterwards.
Oh, wow.
So we were trying to be attractional, like you said. We weren't militant about it. But what kind of a person ends up being attracted to that model?
I think people who have abuse in their life, people who have internal shame, people who have grown up in authoritarian systems outside of the church, right? Whether that's their school or their country or whatever it is, there's
family.
And of course, abusers are attracted to it, right? Because, oh man, if I can get in front of this, one of the ways I describe it in the book and the way I've described it to friends is there was this, I don't even know how to put a word on how it got chosen, but people would self-select and tell you that they've been chosen by God to be this dictator for the congregation, right? And they called it the man of God. And it was like they pulled the Arthur's sword out of the stone. And so if you didn't pull the sword out of the stone, who are you to talk to them, right? But it was so nebulous. It's like, how do you guarantee that you were the one? Like, was the sword already loose, or like is there more than one stone around? Like, how is that you got it and we didn't? And so it created a caste system. And so, I mean, you look at who's attracted to authoritarian governing, or you look at who's attracted to authoritarian companies. Look at the personalities that used to be, because sports in America used to be so authoritarian. It was the coach that yelled at you and made you run 18 miles when you made a mistake or whatever it was.
Yep.
It's an exaggeration, but there are certain personalities drawn to that. Everybody in the system gets something out of it. The women get a sense of safety. The children, like the parents, have a sense that their children are going to turn out better now. Or like there's all these trades that you get when you give up your autonomy. To me now, I just think they're too expensive of a trade.
I remember somebody saying once that the beauty of fundamentalism is that it offers you prepackaged answers, and it's got all the answers. You just come along and say, okay, I don't know what to think. Tell me what to think here. Okay, we'll tell you exactly. Because I was thinking earlier when we were talking about it being a cult, the bite model. I'm sure you've heard of that, Dr. Stephen Hassan's bite model of cults. He was an ex-Mooney, and he's now sort of a cult expert. And it's an acronym. It's BITE. It stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I was thinking that bite model must, you could tick every one of those 4 in your sort of experience growing up in this IFB church system.
For sure. And the irony is so Jesus said the just shall live by faith. And what was never presented to me in all the years that I was in the system is that you can't have faith unless you have doubt, fear, or both. So I'm an adrenaline junkie. I go around the world jumping out of airplanes, jumping off of mountains, jumping off of buildings. One of my favorite things is I go out on the wings of airplanes while they're doing aerobatic maneuvers. And what I've learned is it's only a rush for me. Like I only get the chemical reward when I'm scared, right?
Right.
It's the same thing in my faith. Like my faith doesn't become fully formed unless I'm doing something that's uncomfortable, that's scary, or if I have doubts, is this what I should be doing? Is this the right thing? And so I was presented a God who you should never doubt or you should never be afraid of, right? And to some extent, like you can trust the heart of God. I get that part. But the way that he's always waiting, like my dad was, to knock you down a peg, that he was just like those floor leaders on our hall at college that were peeking in the door to make sure that your light wasn't on, you know. The irony was they were pushing you in further and further and further away from true faith.
That's the ultimate irony, isn't it? Yeah. Because I was going through that phase in my sort of progressive Christian thing before I kind of walked away from all of it. But I was of this sort of persuasion of leaving church to find God. I didn't think you could find God in church, you know, so I was writing articles and then talking to people, teaching my students when I was a Bible college professor about this idea that, hey, you're not going to find God in your typical church. You got to go outside the church, you know, to find him. We're going to be right back in just a few minutes in the second half of this conversation with Ryan George. And as it turns out, even though he has rediscovered some element of his Christian faith, we have a lot in common. We're going to get into how he was connected to the Bill Gothard cult, what exactly makes that a cult, and talk about some shocking revelations that came out about his father in the next half. And I also want to get into the issue of how he was able to reclaim his Christian faith, albeit a very radically different version of Christianity than what he was raised in as an IFB church member and a cultist, he would say. And so this is really interesting to me, talking to Keith Giles in the last episode that we did. I've had a couple of progressive Christians on the show recently, and I think it shows that you can have a respectful dialogue with someone. I'm glad for these guys that they've been able to reclaim some sort of Christian faith. You know, I'm not saying it's a monolithic thing. A lot of people leave Christianity or whatever controlling religion, and they find another version of it that's, you know, a kinder, gentler version of it or whatever. So if it works for him, I'm happy for him. It may not work for you, but it's like I said, it's good to have a respectful dialogue. Just wanted to let you know what's coming up here in the next couple of episodes. I've had a little bit of a break. Me and my sister Valerie went on vacation or holiday. We had a monster epic 10-day tour. We went through 4 countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, back to Belgium, up to Holland, where we stayed with my very good friend Josh de Kaiser. I've never actually met him before in person, but he was on the show years ago. We had a wonderful visit with Josh and his wife, and they took us out to a great meal, and it was a fantastic night. Josh and I sat there over a couple of Belgian beers. We talked about theology, deconstruction, philosophy. We had a great conversation. I kept thinking this would make such a good podcast, so I think I'm going to try to have Josh back on, and we're going to catch up where we left off over, maybe not over a couple of Belgian beers, but we can have a good conversation nonetheless. So then after we left Josh's, we went back on down into Belgium. In fact, the whole trip really was a giant epic World War I, World War II trip, but Valerie and I are very interested in this period of history. But we didn't leave it there. We went back well over 200 years into the past, and then we ended up at Waterloo, the famous battlefield where Napoleon lost in 1815. So we covered a lot of ground. We did something like 1,200 miles in 10 days, just a huge trip. We caught up with my good friend Mike Cunha, who does the Battles of the First World War podcast. We've been friends for a long time. We met up with him back in 2018 down in France in the Somme. We met Mike and some of the members of his tour group. He does a thing called the Lost Battalion Tours. And if you're interested in touring the World War I battlefields, especially kind of the more American side of it, from 1918 when America got involved in the war very late in the war, he does the Lost Battalion Tours. So get a hold of Mike Cunha and look up the Lost Battalion Tours. We had just an unbelievable 2 days with him down in Verdun. And so, yeah, great trip. Overall, had a wonderful time with my sister Valerie. We talked about a lot of stuff that we've covered on this show, talked about our stories and how all the fundamentalists controlling religion, kind of like what Ryan and I are talking about in the first half, how that's affected our lives and how we're rebuilding on the back end. And in fact, speaking of growing up, this is the subject of my book. It is so close to coming out. Tim Sledge and I are working so hard to get all the final edits done. I think it's about 70% finished, all the chapters. So we're getting very, very close. We're hoping to release it, hopefully sometime in August. I keep saying that, but I want to make the book as good as possible. I want it to be a true page turner. So look for that coming out. I will be previewing that and reading the preface chapter for that as a podcast episode. And if you're interested in the book, hopefully go out and buy it, leave a good review on Amazon. So that's coming up hopefully in the month of August. But what's coming out next, we're going to have a conversation with my good friend Dean Crosets. He was on the show years ago. And then we've also got Tia Levings. She's the one who kind of went viral on the Fundy Baby Voice TikTok video months ago. And we talked about Shiny Happy People, the Gothard cult, the whole thing about controlling patriarchal Christianity. So that is a fantastic discussion. We waited on that because her book's coming out, I think, in August or late July. So that's going to be coming out very soon. So look for those 2 episodes coming out. All right, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with Ryan George as we continue this conversation about being hurt and healed by the church, how you can find redemption and reconstruction after spiritual abuse. But now I'm curious about this. Where does the Bill Gothard connection come in? Because you mentioned Shiny Happy People. Were your parents part of the Bill Gothard movement as well in terms of this IFB thing?
I know my dad was very attracted to it. We went to Bill Gothard's training program. Right. We had his materials in our home. My parents, when they started homeschooling us, considered going to his curriculum. I'm thankful.
For homeschooling, the ATI stuff?
Mm-hmm, the ATI stuff. And there was somebody in our county that was doing it. They weren't part of our church, but my parents knew. But it worked out that the college we were going to, they had a homeschool material. So if we used that homeschool material, we'd be better set. And we were. Most of us graduated with academic honors or really good grades. One of my sisters went perfect 4.0 all 8 semesters. One was the president of the nursing class. So that move by my parents turned out. But the pervasiveness of Gothard's teaching wasn't just from the people who hung out with him, because he influenced so many pastors, right? Like they would use his materials. He was one of them. There was another organization called Sword of the Lord, and they would send out the talking points. I think it was monthly, maybe it was every other month. It was basically a newspaper for IFB pastors to get their talking points until the next time, right? Like it's publishing all these IFB sermons and stuff. And so Gothard was just one of multiple streams of IFB influence. Each one had their own little bubble within another bubble, all of which was well underneath the Baptist tradition.
Yeah, so you were part of the Gothard system. Luckily, you weren't completely into it. I mean, in my case, I wasn't homeschooled. I went to Christian school, but my parents were really heavily involved in his teaching. They patterned their marriage after his patriarchal system. They tried to raise us kids according to his sort of quote-unquote godly principles. There was that umbrella of authority thing. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
And that was Gothard's sort of core philosophy, wasn't it? That you have to submit to the authorities above you. And as long as you can do that, you will be blessed by God, as long as you're under your parents' umbrellas, under God's umbrellas and all that. But then that leads to the potential of abuse as well, isn't it? Because you could have this person who's saying, I'm your authority, you must submit to me. Therefore, here comes abuse. And of course, Gothard himself was credibly accused of abusing numbers of women. He's gotten away with it. He's never been held to account for it.
One of the things that I appreciate about my faith is if you believe fully in the warnings of Jesus and the promises of Jesus, you know that no one escapes justice at some point. And then I wouldn't want to be Gothard 2 seconds after he takes his last breath. Right.
Yeah. So, where is he going to end up?
Yeah. And so in some ways, I'm thankful. I haven't fully formed all of my theology around hell, but there's a part of it that I'm thankful that there are people who are destined there if that's your theology.
That's where I was going.
Yeah. But I had friends that came out of his system in college, even male friends who'd been sexually abused in that program. So that program only, because it isolates everybody and it makes you subservient to everybody in the cast, right? And then what you do is you start to, like my dad would use the passages from the Old Testament about Elisha and the she-bears where somebody criticized him and he called out and had, 42 kids, I think, mauled with bears. And there's verses like, touch not the Lord's anointed. They use all these verses. My dad did a despicable thing with at least 2 of the victims that we know so far, and that he would molest them. And then right in front of them, he would pray out loud for forgiveness and then tell them, see, I'm forgiven. So now you don't need to tell anybody because I'm forgiven. And if you do, it's gossip. And we know from the Bible, it says, don't gossip. And so what happens is these guys create the umbrella system sets up a different kind of umbrella. It umbrellas around their own abuse and it protects them from consequences.
to say what you described about your dad, that's so unbelievably insidious, isn't it? It's so manipulative. You know, you got all these levels and layers, don't you? You've got the abuse itself, which is horrific and traumatic, but then you add the spiritual piece, which is what you're saying, you know, using the Bible, using his authority as a man of God, quote unquote, to keep these whatever boys, girls quiet. Man, I can't imagine. Was there ever any fallout? Did he ever sort of have any consequences to the abuse that he did on these kids?
So we still don't know all of the victims. We know there's more than what is publicly known. So one of the victims came forward on a podcast, a victims advocate podcast. That's how I actually learned my dad was a serial predator from that, because I'd only known a couple other situations and only one that was blatant over the line abuse. There was hints all over the place, and now looking back, there's questions. Like, I remember one time, so the IFB movement that we were a part of was really big in door-to-door visitation, kind of like the Jehovah's Witness. And I remember in the 90s, we stopped at a lady's house. We're like, hey, do you have a faith? Do you have a church? We'd love to invite you to our church. She said, well, where do you guys go? And we named the church. And she said, oh, I would never go there. That pastor's having an affair. Mm-hmm. And at the time, before I knew of all of this, you know, the bodies behind the bus, like, that was just a weird anomaly. And the weirdest part was I'm standing next to my mom. She was my visitation partner. And she's like, I'm sorry, ma'am. Like, I'm married to the guy. I would know if he's having an affair. And this stranger that we've never met, we don't know her name. This is the only time we've ever encountered her. She said, well, you don't know your husband. Eventually, wow. She closed the door. And so there was all these moments like that. Like, my parents were teachers in a very small Christian school in Pennsylvania. They were half of we only had 4 teachers for the entire K through 12. And on the middle of a November day, we just up and left school and moved to another state. And the church where my dad was an assistant pastor and a school teacher, they gave him going away money for like a year and a half to get another church started in another state. And so I don't know, did something happen and that, you know, make the problem go away? It may not have been, but now in retrospect, there's like, my dad he had a 3.9 GPA in Bible college. And then we just up and left in the middle of the 80s. And he said, well, I didn't want to take Greek and Hebrew. I was like, man, you were killing every other class.
Yeah. You couldn't handle Greek and Hebrew.
Or could it be the fact that there were girls in our house all the time and that the girls' ensemble, my mom was their seamstress and they're getting fitted in our house? Like, I don't know. Like, I look back at my childhood and go, I don't know what part is real. I don't know what excuses. The first victim that I know about from a timeline, when she came to my mom in, I think, like 2001, 2002, whenever it was, a witness heard my mom say, and this girl heard my mom say, oh, no, not again. So we know there's someone before the ones we know about the ones after that time. Some of them are my close friends. Like, one of them, I mean, I've gone on vacation with her before. Like, it just sickened me, right? I mean, any victim, it's horrible. But when it's somebody that you care about and you've
no idea.
So my parents have like a pool and they've got a big house, monster house. Like, I think like it sleeps like 16 people. It's, you know, it's a big homeschool house. And so there's people coming over and swimming and talking. And my dad runs a business out there. And my wife was over there, was it 2018, I think, maybe 2018, 2019. And my dad was talking to 2 of the middle school girls that were at the house about how the women in Song of Solomon were praised for their body parts. And my wife was like, wait, what? But so when she took it to their parents, they didn't have all the context that we had. Right. And so they're just like, that doesn't make sense. There had to be, you must have missed something, or, you know, because they didn't have, it was a one-off. And it's like, well, that's weird, but it's not. You know, it was grooming for sure in retrospect. Yeah. And then when you put it in context, when we started to hear from different victims, I don't know. I got a guy called me. He saw me doing book promotion. He said, hey, I know more stories about your dad. Give me a call. Really? So I've got that coming up the next week or so to find out. He's not a victim, but he said, I think I got some information to your story that you don't know to put some pieces together. So I know there's more out there. I just don't know what it is.
Is your dad still alive?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, so that's another wrinkle to the whole thing, because in my dad's case, he died several years ago, and he carried all of his secrets to the grave with him. So we never got that closure. We know for sure, like I said, he abused 2 of my sisters for sure, but we don't know who else, what else he did. And we confronted him about it and all these things, and he just denied it. And then he died, you know, so we never have any closure. What's going on with your dad, though? Because, I mean, if he's still alive, there's victims out there running around. Is he ever going to face consequences, do you think?
Oh, that's what we're trying to figure out. I talked to the one victim's attorney. I said, hey, I don't mind putting my dad in prison or whatever. Like, I'll give you whatever. I'm not protecting my dad. I'll help you any way I can. And I answered all of his questions. He's like, thank you. But he said, the problem is, he said, your dad was incredibly slick. And he didn't say incredibly. He's like, your dad was slick. He covered his tracks a little.
Yep. And they always do, though.
Yeah, I've talked to the local detective there in his county has reached out to me because someone opened a case. They're doing an investigation, but the problem is it's unless the victims are willing to talk, which some of them aren't willing to go on record, right?
Yeah.
Unless there's so much of that kind of stuff where it's only a he said, she said anyway. It's not like there's a log book somewhere, you know?
Yeah.
Starting in 2012, I started recording conversations with my dad, when we were confronting him and comparing, the different versions and the different excuses and whatever else. Yeah, I haven't talked to my dad in almost 3 years, 3.5 years maybe.
Yeah.
I saw him at a wedding.
Yeah.
Yeah. We told him, I was like, hey, we'd love for you to get healthy. We'd love for you to confess and repent, go around. My dad used to work in a ministry called Pulpit Helps. So in like lots of rural churches, particularly IFB, it's one pastor. There's nobody there to step up. So when the pastor wants to go on vacation or has a death in the family, they call like this almost like a circuit riding preacher to come fill in. And my dad did that. Yeah, my dad did that for churches all over like a 2 or 3 state area. I know definitely Maryland, but I think Delaware and maybe some Pennsylvania too. But we want you to tell those churches. We want you to tell your pastor. We want you to get into a recovery group, get a counselor. I would have loved to stipulate that he had to turn himself in, but my siblings were like, let's see if he'll do this, go the spiritual route, get healthy, confess. Let's see if there's some repentance in him. He just refused to do any of it. And so we said, these were the conditions for you to have a relationship with us because you're not safe. We all have children. We all have wives. We don't want you near any of them. So
you can't be trusted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's the question. And what did the churches do? Because, we've heard so many thousands of stories. The Southern Baptist Convention is a classic one. 700 churches.
700 some.
Yeah, that we know of.
Right.
Where there's been documented, well-proven cases of clergy abuse. What did the IFB, did they do anything when these allegations came to light?
No, that's the thing. Well, and he never told any of the ones that he was connected to. And I don't know which ones he served. Like, I don't have a list anywhere. The one victim reported it to her Christian college administrators, and they are like, well, we're going to kick it to the IFB pastors in Maryland, let them decide. They know this guy. We'll let him take care of it. So they kicked it over to them, and then the Maryland pastors were like, he said he's sorry. He said he's repented. He's all good now. And so she went, I don't know, maybe 2 decades without any sense of justice. And she was on a podcast in 2021. So I don't know, 19, 20 years she went from the last instance of abuse, holding that because nobody did anything with the story. Because again, no IFB pastor is accountable to it. Those guys had no authority to say, you cannot be a pastor or you need to go into rehab or whatever. Now, legally, as ordained ministers, they should have all turned them into authorities. Like
there's mandatory reporting.
There's mandatory reporting. Yeah.
You have to report it to the authorities.
I know after the one instance, my parents went to quote unquote marriage counseling, but it's actually what I think it is now in retrospect, how it was described. It was trying to get my mom to stay with my dad and to be quiet, but they would drive to another state for that counseling. And my guess is my dad was doing that so that the counselor, because counselors are mandatory reporters as well. Every part of that system let the victims down. And that's not surprising because it's designed to protect these men of God, these quote unquote men of God.
This is it. That's what I was going to ask you. You kind of alluded to that before. How are these systems and structures designed in such a way? Because like you said, I mean, it's attractive to pedophiles, basically, people who are going to abuse children. Maybe they already did somewhere else. Why is it such a favorable model for these predators?
A lack of accountability.
Just
right?
plain
like
simple.
One of the reasons, so I saw statistics, don't quote me on the exact percentage, but something like in 2023, 80% of the convicted sex offenders, not the ones who were charged, but the convicted ones, were church and Christian school and Christian camp personnel, right? And 93% of people who were charged said they were religious, right? So it makes sense. Like, the reason school teachers don't get away with that is because there's accountability systems.
Yeah, there's a structure in place.
Right. A bus driver can't do it. Even in the military, a lot of abuse in the military doesn't get reported, but a lot of it does because there's a chain of command, right? There's and in these systems, these guys are a shaman. They're the witch doctor. They're the rain dancer guy. It's like, so I hiked the Inca Trail several years ago, and just fascinating hearing about all the cultural history. And when the natives came out of the mountain, they left fortified positions. Like, they could have they were self-sustaining. They had agriculture out there. They had water systems. They didn't have to come down to the valley. And they went down to the enemies who had better weapons, whatever else. And the guide, our historian guide, was like, we don't know why they did that. And I, internally, I said, I bet you their holy man said, let's do this.
some priest was behind this thing.
Yeah, he's like, they got shiny clothes. Let's go get some of that. Like I don't know what but
the gods have decreed.
Yeah, because those guys control the whole culture. It's still alive in Africa in certain parts. There's still these, and definitely in Islam, the Amish faith. Usually, the Amish faith, they aren't militant, but they are controlling.
Oh yeah,
and so I think any of these high control, not a lot of vertical infrastructure, a lot of horizontal infrastructure systems are just designed to. They're incentivizing these guys to do what they do.
It seemed like it's true of generally in religious cultures. Every culture has its religion, but the second you set up that dynamic where you've got some sort of deity or gods or whatever, and humanity below, once you insert a priesthood class, they're the mediator between the gods and humanity, then that's a structure right there that's ripe for abuse, because you can just say, well, the gods told me to do whatever. And so, yeah, you put this IFB pastor in, he's this man of God, like you say, this authority figure. You don't question, you don't touch not the Lord's anointed. And then when he abuses a child, they're more than likely to cover it all up. And part of it must be, too, that they don't want to bring reproach against the church itself. That's a pattern we've seen, with so many places. We don't want to, cast aspersions on the organization as well. So it's going to damage our reputation if we admit this guy.
Yeah, he wraps himself in the gospel to say, if you assail me, you're assailing the gospel.
Yeah.
If you go forward with me, you're hurting Jesus. Right. One of the things my dad told me on the phone, one of our conversations, he said, I could never confess my sin to like the smaller things that led to the big stuff. He's like, I couldn't confess those to my congregation because then I lose my standing as the holy man.
Right.
Whereas in my faith system now, at all levels of leadership, people are regularly confessing, because the book of James, Jesus' little brother, said, without confessing your sins, you can't be healthy. Confessing is how we're healed. And so it makes sense. Like if you're in a system where the holy man has to project this image that I don't ever make mistakes so that nobody ever believes that I do, which is so preposterous. Yeah. That means that guy can't be healthy emotionally, spiritually, anyway, relationally healthy.
Not possible.
So it shouldn't be a surprise that unhealth leads to unhealthy and despicable things.
And I can remember that as a pastor, you were caught in this weird dynamic whereby our elder board used to say to me, you need to be transparent when you're preaching. You need to be talking about, your struggles, and clearly you have flaws and faults. You're not perfect. But then when I did, it ended up getting used against me. So it's like a catch-22. You can kind of see where these guys are coming from. I can kind of see your dad's point as much as I don't want to defend him at all. But
Same.
It's so hard to be a pastor because you put up on this pedestal and then people start kind of throwing stones at you, but you can't admit to being flawed. It's a really messed up dynamic.
I don't think that how pastorhood as it's practiced in our modern culture, particularly Western culture and specifically American culture, is healthy. I don't know that that's how it was designed to be. The verses in Ephesians where it says, submit yourselves one to another. The faith environments I'm in right now, we disciple each other. One of the faith communities I'm a part of, we got guys from the age of 17 to 80, and nobody teaches. There's never a lesson. There's never a sermon. We sit at a table and we go, well, what did you find here? What did you find here? What are you struggling with? What can I pray for you this week? And it's all equal. And in the church where my wife's on staff, where I serve, like what would be more considered like a traditional church in the United States, we don't even have rows. So our pastor comes out for 10 minutes. He's like, hey, here's what we're going to be talking about today. Here's the Bible. Make sure you have at least 4 people at your table. So even our Sunday services are in circles. And there's nobody from the church sitting at the table. There's no like table leader, discussion leader. There's nobody walking around listening. Pastors just trust that the Holy Spirit's going to guide everybody to disciple each other. And so you might have a table of 4 80-year-olds. You might have a table of an 80-year-old, a 60-year-old, a 40, and a 20. And we just trust that the Holy Spirit's going to do what he's going to do. And so what's happened is you have this egalitarian approach to discovering Scripture. You're like, hey, we're all sheep. We may be more mature or less mature sheep, but we all have something that we can contribute. We all have a perspective that's valid. And it ends up doing what the Old Testament calls iron sharpening iron, right? It's, instead of somebody beating you as a man of God into the shape that he wants you to be, you're letting Scripture filter through the souls around you evenly. We're kind of a counterculture. When our church shifted to that several years ago, a lot of people left the church and just like didn't have a category for it. But a lot of other people were attracted to our church because like that's different. If they had wounds from a pastor or from someone saying, thus saith the Lord, and telling you what to think, the more democratic way of coming at it,
Okay, so yeah, it sounds like a lot more democratic than certainly your traditional, celebrity pastor up there, the Mark Driscoll kind of guy,
Right.
He's a superstar.
It can lead itself to abuse. So it's not just IFB, right? Like it can be any system.
Oh, yeah. It's like I said, the system is rife for that sort of abuse. Well, how did you retain your faith? Because, I mean, we were saying before we hit record, the difference between you and me, we have similar backgrounds on some levels. But for me, I got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. So I've walked away from the church. I walked away from Christianity. I'm an ex-evangelical. How did you come back and find this faith after walking away from it?
There's a bunch of contributing factors, but one of them was I ran into a group of people who interacted with Jesus like the people in the Gospels did. You know, it was interesting in the Gospels, every spectrum, rich and poor, old and young, you know, Jew and Gentile, religious and not religious, all the different fishermen and well-educated, everybody was attracted to this guy. And there was this, like, I mean, crowds would instantly, I mean, he could have had a mega church if he wanted it, right? And that was not an attractive Jesus was not what I grew up with. And I met people that were in love with an attractive Jesus, and I loved what their lives looked like. I loved how their kids honored them. I loved how their wives responded to them, or husbands responded. You know, I saw how they were in the community, how many more foster children and adoptions and all the things, making wrongs right, and social justice, whatever else. I went, they have something that I don't have. And I remember the first time I came into the faith community, we had this bring your questions environment for like 8 weeks where you could work through all this stuff. And then at the end of each night, they would have like a prayer time, like, hey, what can we pray for you till our meeting next week? And our leaders, not somebody who was there, like our leaders from the church were like, hey, we're really struggling with the idea that God is good because we're trying to have baby and nothing is working for years. We've tried all this stuff. We spent thousands of dollars and we're just struggling with the idea that God is good. And I'd never heard anybody in a church be allowed to say something like that, let alone in leadership. Part of it was who was leadership. So one of our pastors was a wilderness guide and then became a pastor. And then he got his doctorate in ethnography, where you study subcultures and figure them out. And he did an ethnographic study of our 2-county area here and said, how can I make a church that's safe for the people who aren't currently in church? And so what happened was I was around people who were super pragmatic, where questions were welcomed, where there was emotional intelligence, there was intellectual honesty. And I just went, whoa, this is the real thing, you know? And as I experienced it and I claimed, there's a promise that Jesus says, he's like, hey, if you want to find me, I promise you will. Like, so, but you have to want to find me. And so I went literally to all 7 continents, both polar circles, looking for Jesus. I went to I read hundreds of nonfiction books, inside, outside of my faith, different. And I kept coming back to these very real encounters with a Jesus that looked like the Jesus in the New Testament that everybody felt comfortable around, except for the religious people. Even the Romans, right? Even the soldiers were like, dude, this guy is something different. The women felt safe. That was a big thing for me, right? Like, I've watched my dad exploit women and children, and the Jesus of the New Testament said it's better to be cast in the sea with a millstone around your neck than to have the fate of someone who harms a child. And when they brought him adulterous women, or however you want to say it, like, he let them sit at his feet. He let one of them wash his feet with her tears. It's so intimate. So I started having these intimate encounters where I would claim Jesus. I said, hey, you told me that if I sought you, I would find you. So I'm going to claim that promise. And I started, like, on a small level, I wrote a blog post last year. I was about to get on a flight to Finland to do some Arctic survival training. And I said, God, I don't know why I'm compelled to go to Finland right now. I don't know why I'm compelled to fly this airline. I've never flown, whatever. So would you show me why it is you? And by the time I finished that flight, I knew why he had me going to Finland. And everything else I did in Finland was a cherry on top. So I was like, that's why Jesus had me do this. I keep having these personal encounters, whether directly myself or through people who are having just these surreal experiences, transcendent experiences. I was like, I want that. And now I have it, and I want other people to have it and to know that it's possible after coming up through what I came up through.
Well, I'm glad it's worked for you, man. I really am, because, you know, for me, it didn't work, but I tried all those things you tried, but I had the exact opposite reaction, you know.
Oh, man.
So it is a fascinating thing, but I know you got to go. You've got to get back to work. Remind us again, your book is called Hurt and
Healed by the Church. Yeah. The subtitle is Redemption and Reconstruction After Spiritual Abuse. You can find it at booksbyryan.com. All my books are there. I'm on social media. You can look me up, Ryan George. I work on Facebook. That's my day job, so I was able to secure my name everywhere.
Right.
You look for Ryan George, you'll find me for sure.
You'll find there's got to be a few other Ryan Georges around the world.
There's more famous Ryan Georges. There's a YouTuber out there who's got way more followers than me, but it's easy to find me. Look for pictures of people doing crazy stuff because, like, I like to get my adrenaline rushes any way I can.
Yeah, you sound like a real adrenaline junkie. I'm not going to be jumped out of planes anytime soon.
Oh, you're missing out. It's a good time.
I'm missing out. Yeah, it's true. Well, the next time you're on one of your adventures, if you ever go over in the UK, look me up. We can at least have a pint together and maybe,
there you go.
Set the world's problems to rights or whatever. But listen, Ryan, thank you so much. I know you got to get back to work, but it's been fascinating talking to you. I'm sure we'll touch base again. So take care. Have a great day.
All right, man. Thank you so much.